Good afternoon, everybody. Today's hearing probes the question of whether or not there is an African resource curse. The resource curse refers to the paradox in which countries and regions with an abundance of natural resources, specifically non-renewable resources like minerals and fuels, tend to have less economic growth and worse development outcomes than countries with fewer natural resources. This is believed to happen for many reasons, including a decline in the competitiveness of other economic sectors, the volatility of revenues from the natural resource sector due to global commodity market swings, government mismanagement of resources, or weak, ineffectual, unstable, or corrupt institutions. Africa has an abundance of natural resources, from critical and desirable agricultural products such as gum arabic to strategic minerals such as cobalt, titanium, and coltan, to energy resources such as petroleum and natural gas. However, under the so-called Africa resource curse, African citizens don't benefit from these resources to the extent that would be expected. Education, healthcare, and other services too often are not provided to citizens by their governments who profit from African resources, but rather are too often paid for by donors. Throughout history, African resources have led to negative outcomes for African people, more often than positive ones, such as slavery, colonization, predatory governments, and vicious rebel group activity. The ivory trade opened Africa to trans-Saharan trade to the Middle East and beyond, but it also opened Africa up to the earliest days of international slavery. Africa gold and other natural wealth made the continent and personalities in it famous and admired, but also led to even more expansive transatlantic slave trade. Ivory hunters wiped out the elephant population of various locations in Africa, and in recent years included the Lord's Resistance Army and its murderous reign of terror in the Great Lakes region. Minerals that power modern society also fund the chaos brought by militias such as M23 and numerous other militias now terrorizing the eastern portion of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So-called blood diamonds earlier funded predatory rebels in Liberia and Sierra Leone. What should be a blessing, abundant natural resources, has all too often been a curse. It has been argued, for example, that one can correlate the rise and fall in the price of petroleum with the rise and fall of the implementation of human rights in major oil-producing countries. Protection of human rights throughout resource-cursed countries is dismal or completely lacking. Most resource-cursed countries are ruled by either authoritarian or other types of repressive regimes. These regimes are kept in power by an elite group, such as those comprised of high-ranking politicians and military leaders. As long as the existing government, keeps these few people happy, they can rule without fear of consequences. This system is set up so that those most in need of protection are left to fend for themselves. Equatorial Guinea is an example of how the resource curse works. It is a small country with a population of slightly more than 500,000 people, but a gross domestic product that has increased more than 125 times, not 125%, 125 times since oil production began in the mid-1990s. On paper, the wealth per capita in Equatorial Guinea is as high as almost any wealthy country in Africa, if not higher. Yet if you visit the country and move beyond the gleaming new hotels and resorts, you will find numerous people who are forced to survive on $1 a day or less. Corruption in Equatorial Guinea is rampant. President Obiang owns 2 luxury homes in Washington, D.C. area, and his sons own 2 homes and numerous luxury cars in California. In fact, it is estimated that the president's son spent more on houses and cars alone in between 2004 and 2006 than the entire government spent on education in the year of 2005. Facts involving Equatorial Guinea's government's siphoning of natural resources profits were revealed in a 2004 U.S. Senate investigation of the Riggs Bank, which could no longer continue operations due to financial improprieties, partly involving questionable funds from Equatorial Guinea. The Obiang family dominates private business in the country, so commerce there benefits them first and foremost. rather than provide a means of economic opportunity more broadly. In order to counteract corrupt practices from profits from natural resources and to ensure they're not diverted or otherwise abused, various international agreements, as we all know, have been created. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or ITI, was created and announced at the 2002 World Summit for Sustainable Development in Johannesburg to provide a multi-stakeholder system that would require disclosure of profits from natural resource extraction. Thus far, 34 countries have produced EITI reports covering $1.02 billion in total government revenue. 4 African countries have been officially suspended from the process for non-compliance: the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, and Sierra Leone. Similarly, the Kimberley Process certification scheme established in 2009 by the UN General Assembly Resolution 5556 is designed to prevent conflict diamonds from entering the mainstream rough diamond markets. Global Witness, which presents testimony today, pulled out of the scheme 2 years ago, but there are those within the organization that reportedly still believe it provides at least a basis for addressing the problem of blood diamonds. Neither African governments nor the international community are helpless to effectively address the misuse of African natural resources. Working together, we can ensure that corruption is minimized, if not eliminated altogether. Protection of wildlife and other natural resources must be achieved. The day of corrupt governments shirking their responsibilities so that a select few can benefit from their country's blessings must be ended. Earlier today in Congress, we honored the life, legacy, and values of former South African President Nelson Mandela on his 95th birthday. During one of his visits to Congress, he told members that to deny a person's human rights is to deny their humanity. We must do all we can, not only to ensure that African natural resources benefit the people of African countries economically, but also to guarantee that human rights of African people are more fully respected by those who wield power through government authority or by the barrel of a gun. Thank you very much for my colleagues for being here, and I would like to yield to Karen Bass, the ranking member, for any opening comments you might have.
As always, thank you, Mr. Chair, for convening this meeting on African resources and what will be done to ensure that a continent with immense resource wealth is able to leverage those resources to promote broad and sustained development. I also want to thank today's witnesses for making yourselves available to brief this committee and the work all of you do to expose the challenges on this and other relevant topics. I also want to give a special greeting and thanks to Mr. Bolden for lending your star power to this issue. Mr. Bolden, I know that you will mention in your statement that in consultation with Oxfam, I've also written a letter that's co-signed by members of Congress that calls on ECOWAS to develop a regional mining code that will apply to all 15 member nations and that will protect the basic rights of local communities. I have often shared my strong interest in this committee focusing on Africa and the growth opportunities that exist throughout the continent. Mr. Obama recently returned from Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania, and his message was clear. Our language, our perception of Africa must change. Business, trade, and investment are the conversations we need to have with African nations. I have to tell you that I was a little disappointed in the coverage of his trip because oftentimes the news covered Africa and the fact that he was on the continent almost as a backdrop and focused on other issues of the day that were important to our country, but really didn't spend a lot of time covering the nations that he was visiting. But I'm pleased that today's panel is prepared to discuss a set of issues that present extraordinary opportunity and at the same time illustrates the deep challenges that face African nations. The question before us is how can African nations benefit from their natural resource wealth and take that wealth to expand and accelerate development that will ultimately lift millions out of poverty? As I often mention, Africa is not the next economic frontier, but the emerging market of today. We have seen strong double-digit and near double-digit growth in places like Angola, Nigeria, Mozambique, and Rwanda. I visited several African nations over the last year that share with us their strong desire not to engage our government in more of the same forms of aid, but to shift our discussion to topics of trade, dealing and arrangements that provide and promote private sector engagement, economic growth, and job creation. What's remarkable about this is that our nation has the comparative advantage to play a key role in the continent's economic emergence, but we have yet to fully act. These trade and business gains cannot be fully realized, however, until we address some of the well-known barriers, including and specifically around natural resources, extractive industries, and the laws and regulatory environments needed to ensure billions of the world poor benefit from their country's natural resources. Countries like Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Liberia are poised to reap benefits from new discoveries of oil, but many wonder if they will. In my travels, I've grown deeply concerned with contracts from multinational companies, particularly those from more developed nations where resource extraction doesn't necessarily do much for the majority of the people. I would like to learn more about those contracts. I had an experience of being in the DRC and just leaving from the airport and going to the embassy and seeing such unbelievable poverty and knowing that the resources in the DRC are some of the greatest on the planet, and what companies are doing business that's extracting those resources. And I'm particularly interested if any of them are our companies or companies from the United States. I know that some of the issues are that some of the African countries might negotiate poor terms with the extractive companies. They don't necessarily collect resource revenues effectively, and then when they do, where those resources go, of course, is a question. So I'm pleased that there are a number of programs and initiatives, including Dodd-Frank, that have been created to address and bring greater accountability and transparency across the African continent and the world. These include the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, a voluntary multi-stakeholder program that promotes revenue transparency and accountability associated with the extractive industries. The Open Government Partnership, a multilateral initiative to promote more effective responses to governance by improving public services, increasing public integrity, managing public resources, creating safer communities, and increasing corporate accountability. Now, I've also heard that some of the provisions that were put into Dodd-Frank actually have some unintended consequences when it comes to the extracted industries, and I'm not sure if we will learn about those today, but hopefully some of our witnesses might be able to reference that. I believe these programs are making a real difference, and I'll be interested to also hear from our witnesses if the programs are effective. I'm also interested to know how the 2013 Resource Governance Index ensures resource wealth benefits those countries and people who greatly depend on proper management of those resources. I want to thank you, and I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses today.
Yes, thank you so very much. Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. And on a personal note, as an avid Florida State fan, I have cheered for you for many years with each reception, and it's those wonderful hands that today I cheer for you even louder because of what you are doing here today in this important work. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of many here in Congress for highlighting this particular issue. You know, we've known for a long time that Africa has just a great potential with natural resources, you know, a number of natural resources that not only could serve as an engine for economic development, but possibly move the entire continent to a new era of prosperity. And unfortunately, that hadn't happened. We've seen, as the chairman and the ranking member have testified already and shared, that those challenges from around the world just really create areas of great concern. Some of those challenges are gone. Many of them still remain, and some of those challenges now are new. They're evolving each day as we start to look at it. You know, today too much of Africa is really ruled by repressive and oppressive regimes that take those natural resources as an asset to leverage power and to stay in power, and truly not to improve the lives of the people within their own country. That's deplorable. Human rights violations, as we have heard testimony a number of times before this committee, the human rights violations continue to happen over and over again. And this leverage, this tool that continues to get used, really needs to be one that we hold those that are using them as a weapon, hold them accountable. The chairman and the ranking member have really, on a bipartisan basis, really worked very well together to make sure not only that it's highlighted, that we in Congress make sure that we do what is possible from a legislative standpoint to address it. And so I look forward to hearing that. I hope that we look to an Africa that is truly transformed one day, and that because some of the testimony that we hear today affects the lives of the people in many countries throughout that wonderful continent. I'm going to apologize beforehand because of votes and everything. I've got 2 hearings, and so I'll be bouncing back and forth, but I just want to say thank you for coming, thank you for your interest, and I thank the chairman and the ranking member, and I yield back.
Mr. Meadows, thank you very much for your leadership and for your participation in a very meaningful way in every hearing we have had and markup. So thank you. I'd like to now welcome our very distinguished panel of witnesses, beginning with Corinna Gilfian, who's the head of the U.S. Office for Global Witness and has worked for more than 10 years to strengthen governance over natural resources. She led Global Witness's campaign to combat conflict diamonds, and since 2004 has directed Global Witness's U.S. office right here in D.C. She currently serves on the International Board of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and has been an adjunct instructor at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. She also previously worked for the UN Environmental Program in Paris and was director of Friends of the Earth, U.S.'s Ozone Protection Program. We will then hear from Mohammed Amin Adam, who is the executive director of the Africa Center for Energy Policy. Before joining ACEP, he was coordinator of IPIS's extraction industries program in Africa. He has also worked as an oil coordinator to publish What You Can Pay Ghana. Mr. Adam also served in various positions in the public sector in Ghana, including in the energy ministry, and as mayor of Ghana's 3rd largest city. He is also a member of the consortium that worked on Ghana's first EITI report on oil and gas. He also participated in designing meetings for 2 global governance initiatives, the Open Governance Partnership and Open Contracting. Then we will hear from Anquan Boldin. I would just point out that I had, and Greg had the privilege of meeting with Anquan on June 24th and had a very good meeting. He gave us an update of his work in this area. And while Greg and I had been talking about doing a hearing like this sometime in the future, it crystallized at that meeting that sooner would be better than later. And matter of fact, we asked what his availability was with training coming up, training camp. So that's why it's being done and was put together rather quickly. But Anquan Boldin is a professional football player, as we all know, in the San Francisco 49ers, but is here today in his capacity as an ambassador of Oxfam. He has worked tirelessly to give back both in the United States and in Africa. And in connection with this work, he founded the Anquan Boldin Q81 Foundation to bring hope to underprivileged children. In March 2012, in response to a severe drought in Ethiopia, he traveled with a friend and former teammate, Larry Fitzgerald, to Ethiopia to visit Oxfam programs and to bring attention to the need in that region. Together, he and Mr. Fitzgerald visited people and communities working hard to rebuild and carried the stories of the people they met back home, appearing on many prominent news outlets and, again, now here before the U.S. Congress to speak to each and every one of us. We will then hear from Mr. Tutu Alikiante, I should say, who is from Equatorial Guinea and is the founder and executive director of EG Justice. His organization is dedicated to promoting human rights, the rule of law, transparency, and civic participation in his homeland. Before founding E.G. Justice, he worked as a legal consultant with international NGOs promoting legal accountability and transparency in the extractive industry. In 2007, he received a fellowship from Echoing Green to establish E.G. Justice. Prior to that, he worked as an employment attorney with the Southern Migrant Legal Services, where he represented migrant farm workers. So, Karina, if we could begin with you. And again, I want to thank our distinguished witnesses for sharing their expertise and their time with our subcommittee today.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for holding this hearing today to focus on the resource curse in Africa. I work for Global Witness, which is an international advocacy organization working to break the links between natural resources, conflict, and corruption. The African continent is rich in oil, gas, and other minerals. In 2010, the value of exports of oil and minerals from Africa was worth $333 billion, about 6 times the value of exported agricultural products, and nearly 7 times the value of international aid. Such resource wealth has the potential to lift many of Africa's poorest out of poverty, yet often we see the opposite. African resource-rich countries mired in poverty because the public revenues earned from selling these resources are being squandered through corruption and lack of government accountability. An example of this is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the richest countries in natural resources that is at the bottom of the Human Development Index. Congo lost at least $1.36 billion from the underpriced sales of copper and cobalt mining assets between 2010 and 2012 in secret deals involving companies registered in British overseas territories that could keep their ownership secret. This is almost twice the country's annual spending on health and education combined. In Guinea, there are corruption concerns related to the company BSGR's acquisition of Blocks 1 and 2 of the massive Simandou iron ore concession. A series of secret contracts seen by Global Witness spells out how BSGR promised Mamadi Touré, one of the 4 wives of then Ghanaian dictator Lansana Conté, millions of dollars in shares in Simandou in return for help in acquiring the licenses. BSGR paid nothing for its rights to Simandou and sold 51% of its stakes to Valley in 2010 for $2.5 billion. To put this deal into context, the Ghanaian government's entire annual budget in 2010 amounted to just $1.2 billion. Natural resources are also funding conflict in Africa. For the last 15 years, armed groups and members of the National Army have used profits from the trade in certain minerals to finance themselves and their operations in eastern DRC, fueling a war that has cost over 5.4 million lives. The metals mined in eastern Congo enter global markets and make their way into products we use every day, such as mobile phones, cars, airplanes, and jewelry. In Zimbabwe, the ruling ZANU-PF elite is using Zimbabwe's diamond wealth as a source of off-budget financing for partisan security forces with a track record of committing human rights violations against Zimbabwe's civilian population. Increasing transparency in the extractive sector is crucial to combat the resource curse. It deters corruption, creating an enabling environment for better resource governance and giving citizens information to hold their governments to account. The encouraging news is that there is a rising tide of transparency. The U.S. government has exhibited strong leadership by passing Sections 1502 and 1504 of Dodd-Frank. Section 1502, the conflict minerals provision, aims to cut off financing to abusive armed groups involved in the minerals trade in eastern Congo. Section 1504 requires extractive companies to publicly disclose payments to governments on a country and project level. U.S. leadership has catalyzed global action. The European Union and other countries are now following suit. Increased transparency through initiatives like the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative will also empower citizens in African resource-rich countries to demand government accountability for responsible resource use. The Africa Progress Panel, led by Kofi Annan, recently issued a groundbreaking report entitled Equity in Extractives, which calls on governments to promote greater transparency of the extractive sector and tackle hidden company ownership. We very much appreciate the work of the subcommittee in addressing corruption and human rights issues in Africa, and we today would like to make the following policy proposals for consideration. First, effectively implement and enforce Sections 1502 and 1504 of Dodd-Frank. Second, make the transparent and responsible management of natural resources an integral part of U.S. foreign policy objectives, and mainstream resource governance as a core part of U.S. assistance to resource-rich countries. A key part of this should involve protecting human rights and actively supporting civil society in its efforts to hold governments to account over management of resource revenues. Third, tackle hidden company ownership in the U.S. to prevent American companies from being misused to move corrupt and other dirty money into the U.S. financial system. In conclusion, the U.S. government has an important role to play in helping address the resource curse in Africa. Better governance of natural resources will contribute to stability and economic development in African countries, help protect U.S. national energy security interests, and promote a more stable operating environment for American companies and investors. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Mr. Adam.
Mr. Chairman, ranking member of the committee, thank you most sincerely for inviting me to a hearing of the subcommittee addressing the question, is there an African resource curse? And in particular, to give a testimony to this subject. As you know, the subject of resource curse in Africa is very broad, and I would like, with your permission, to focus my testimony on Ghana's management of her natural resources. As a petroleum economist and an activist, I read by the day the alarming rate at which Africa's natural resources are being plundered. But Ghana is trying recently to take a departure from this path. At the height of the global financial and economic crisis in 2007, Ghana discovered oil and gas in commercial quantities, estimated at 1.8 billion barrels of reserves. Oil has now become the second largest export commodity of Ghana, following gold, but overtaking cocoa. By the end of 2012, more than 50 million barrels of crude oil was produced from what we call the Jubilee fields, which commenced production in late 2010. The positive impact of oil is already being felt in the budget. The government of Ghana received $541 million last year. Significant efforts have been made, as I said, to avoid the curse of oil, building on our ever-improving democratic regime, which many people consider a new paradigm of countries in Africa determined to break away from the resource curse. Once called the Gold Coast, Ghana has been a major producer of gold, which is now the largest export commodity of the country. This year, 2012, marks Ghana's highest earning from mining in its history, with export revenues of $5.6 billion. But in spite of these developments, the cost of mining to the country has been too high. Destruction to the environment, human rights abuses, displacement of communities, and low compensation paid to affected communities, while mineral revenues have not translated to tangible development outcomes. In its attempt to avoid the mistakes of the mining industry and those of oil-producing countries which got entangled in the curse of resource world, the government of Ghana embarked on far-reaching policy and legislative development built on public consultations and greater openness. These include the Petroleum Revenue Management Act and the Petroleum Commission Act. Some of the most important provisions in these laws are a requirement that oil receipts, production lifting, and sales prices and expenditure from oil must be published quarterly and annually. The establishment of the Public Interest and Accountability Committee to provide independent assessment of how oil revenues are being used. Ghana is an EITI-compliant country and has already issued a reconciliation report on oil 2 years into production. While these great efforts are commendable, good laws only provide a framework for managing the resources. Indeed, the resource curse is a manifestation of poor implementation of regulations, and Ghana is one of the countries that is unable to implement its good laws. Abuse of regulations through regulatory capture and weak accountability institutions capable of checking rent-seeking behavior and vested interest. These problems are compounded by impunity and political patronage, which have often undermined the government's ability to act. Ghana is therefore unlikely to escape the resource curse with oil, unless a number of issues are addressed. 1. Ghana's accountability institutions and regulators are still weak and are not resourced to work independently. The Public Interest and Accountability Committee and the new Petroleum Commission, two institutions responsible for oil revenue monitoring and oil regulations, have not been provided with a budget since they were established. 2. For both oil and minerals, there is no open tendering or bidding process for acquiring, prospecting, or exploration rights. There is also no mandatory contract disclosure, and contracts are published at the discretion of the Minister of Energy or Natural Resources. Oil and mining deals are kept confidential, and the system provides opportunities for hidden benefits to companies as well as avenues for tax evasion. Further, beneficial owners are not disclosed, which promotes rent-seeking behavior. 3. Ghana is losing revenues through tax avoidance and transfer pricing, and has between 1970 and 2008 lost $4.9 billion through illicit financial flows, including lost revenues from resource taxes. 4. Also, the country is not deriving value from money from the infrastructure projects funded with oil and gas revenues, as most of the projects have been delayed, operating under costly extensions and leading to cost overruns. Mr. Chairman, Ghana has shown the way in spite of these challenges and fully determined to change course and escape the resource curse, but important challenges still remain, which need to be looked at. The United States can support Ghana and other African countries to address these challenges. The need to implement the extractive industry payment disclosure provisions in the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act is long overdue. The U.S. support for the implementation of an Economic Community of West African States Directive on Mining that includes transparency safeguards, but also protection of free, prior, and informed consent for communities impacted negatively by these projects is also important. Finally, the U.S. should also support the building of strong institutions, including negotiation capacity and technical support to help establish the geological data that enhances the value of these natural resources. If the U.S. is forthcoming with this support, I believe that Ghana and many other African countries will change their course and therefore will be ready to manage these resources efficiently and in the interest of their people. I thank you very much for the opportunity.
Mr. Adam, thank you very much for your testimony. I'd like to now, Mr. Bolden, if you would proceed.
Mr. Chairman, it's an honor to be here today. Thank you for your personal invite for me to testify. On behalf of myself and Oxfam America, I want to say thank you and the ranking member for holding this important meeting on natural resources in Africa. The issues you are discussing today are critically important to Africa's future. There are experts here today who will talk about how natural resource wealth in Africa can be seen as both a blessing and a curse. I'd like to share what I learned about how this resource wealth plays out in communities where these resources are extracted. During my visits to Africa, I promised the people I met that I would do everything I can to bring their stories back to the U.S., to the leaders who can make improvements. This is why I'm here today. I believe you have the power to really help people in Africa, and specifically Senegal. Earlier this year, I traveled to the village of Sabadola in eastern Senegal. I met many wonderful people there. They opened their community to me and shared their experiences with me, my wife Dion, and my friends Roddy White and Larry Fitzgerald. Sadly, the community of Sabadola and many others like it throughout West Africa has been directly and severely impacted by large-scale gold mining operations. Just a few years ago, the people of Sabadola farmed their land sustainably and rarely worried about whether they would have enough food to feed their families. In their spare time, many community members mine for small quantities of gold, just as they have for countless generations. They used it to supplement their farming income, and neither they nor the generations before them were ever dependent on the gold they would find in the ground for their livelihood. All that changed a few years ago when the land they farmed was sold right out from up under them to a large mining company. The community, which had been farming the same land for generations, suddenly had nothing. They were given a choice: accept new land high up on a hillside, miles away from their homes, or take a small one-time cash buyout that could not sustain their families the way they farmed had for so many years. Every day, communities in Africa are losing their land and seeing little or no benefit from the enormous mining operations that are pushing them aside and moving into their backyards. No percentage of the revenue from the mine in Sabodala, which is bigger than several football stadiums and bring in untold revenues, ever makes its way back to the community. They pull rocks from the road, sometimes miles away from where they live. They break them in bowls with metal poles. They grind the rock into fine dirt. They sift the dirt to find gold dust. Then they use mercury to extract the gold by hand. It's a grueling, dangerous process, and there's absolutely no way to make a living. I told the people of Sabodala that I would bring the stories back to the U.S. I believe the U.S. Congress should call on Senegal's President Macky Sall to take action to improve the conditions of mining-affected communities in eastern Senegal. President Sall should ensure that mining companies respect human rights, that mining revenue is managed in a transparent way, and that communities receive an adequate compensation and have a meaningful voice in decision-making about where mining takes place. The good news is that the countries of West Africa, including Senegal, are considering adopting a regional mining code that apply to 15 countries in the region. I believe that adoption of this code would help strengthen protections for the human rights of people in mining-affected communities like Kédougou. I call on the Congress to support this and other measures to strengthen human rights protections for communities impacted by the oil and mining industries in Africa. One important thing I respectfully request you all to do right now is to sign on to Congresswoman Bass's letter in support of the regional mining code. This letter can have a big impact in West African countries as they consider adoption of the code. As a professional athlete, I believe strongly in fair play. I believe that Congress can play an important role in helping ensure fair play for Africans, and that the money produced by the gold, oil, and other resources that come out of Africa's ground are used to help all Africans prosper. I hope that you will join me in taking action to ensure that this happens. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the members of the committee for your attention to this issue.
Mr. Bolden, thank you very much for your testimony, and you and your wife for the visit that we did have, which I think was very, very meaningful to me, and I know to Greg and the rest of my staff. So thank you again for your very concrete recommendations and for doing what you said you would do, bring back to the Congress and to the American people what exactly is going on in Senegal and in other places in West Africa. Mr. Alicante?
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for this opportunity. In 1993, the military arrived in my village in Equatorial Guinea to suppress an uprising. They arrested and tortured all the young men in sight, publicly executed 2 of them. They burned down my family's house. That evening, I asked my father what we could do. His response to me was, "There is nothing we can do." His words of defeat reflect the environment of gross human rights violations, absolute impunity in which I grew up. 5 months later, I came to the United States. I became a lawyer and have since worked for human rights and transparency in Equatorial Guinea. Imagine a tiny country of 700,000 people suddenly flushed with oil money, where the wealth per person is on par with that of Italy. Now imagine a place where nearly 2/3 of the population lives in extreme poverty. Infant and child mortality are on par with ravaged Democratic Republic of the Congo. Impossible as this sounds, these 2 scenarios describe the same country, Equatorial Guinea. It is a textbook case for the resource curse. Oil production in Equatorial Guinea began 20 years ago. Today, Equatorial Guinea has the highest GDP per capita in Africa. However, despite this enormous wealth, the majority of citizens are mired in poverty without access to water or sanitation. The country is richer than Poland, but has a child death rate 20 times higher. It boasts the largest gap between income and human development. It ranks among the lowest for primary school enrollment. The Obiang regime in power since 1979, has a long record of human rights violations, including arbitrary arrest and torture. Freedom House ranks it among the worst of the worst. Corruption is endemic. Equatorial Guinea is among the least transparent countries in the world. Contracts for oil exploration and production were and continue to be negotiated in secret without an opportunity for national debate or informed consent. President Obiang has stated that oil revenues are a secret, a state secret. He uses oil to monopolize economic, political, and military power. Oil revenues finance luxury purchases for the ruling family. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, between 2001 and 2010, President Obiang's son allegedly spent more than $300 million on mansions, sports cars, and luxury items, far exceeding the amount that the country spends per year on health and education combined. He allegedly uses numerous anonymous shell companies set up in the U.S. to secretly move a sizable portion of that money into the U.S. The DOJ has concluded that the money was acquired through corrupt means and has moved to seize some of those assets. 4 American oil companies, ExxonMobil, Hess, Marathon, and Noble Energy, dominate the oil industry in Equatorial Guinea. Therefore, the United States has an opportunity to help reverse the resource curse in Equatorial Guinea. Section 1504 of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act, which requires oil, gas, and mining companies to publish the payments they make to governments for natural resources, aims to provide citizens of countries like Equatorial Guinea with much-needed information to hold governments accountable for the use of natural resource revenues. Disappointingly, some American companies like ExxonMobil are supporting the lawsuit, and a lawsuit aimed to undermine 1504, suggesting that they prefer secrecy to transparency. I respectfully ask this committee to take specific steps that would lead to improved governance in Equatorial Guinea, including by first urging the SEC to issue strong rules in support of the Dodd-Frank 1504. Second, supporting the Incorporation Transparency and Law Enforcement Assistance Act that Congresswoman Maloney plans to introduce hopefully tomorrow to put an end to the anonymous shell companies so often used by corrupt government officials to move and hide illicit money. Press the government of Equatorial Guinea to respect civil society organizations and political opposition parties. Expand the Magnitsky Act to cover kleptocrats and human rights violators globally. Implement Presidential Proclamation 7750 to deny U.S. visas to members of the government of Equatorial Guinea. I look forward to the day that all Equatorial-Guineans can fully and equitably benefit from the natural resources of our country. I thank the U.S. government for working hard to bring that day closer, and I thank you for holding this important hearing. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for your testimony. Thank you for your perseverance, obviously under very, very difficult and dire circumstances, and for being here to encourage us, give us a blueprint, as you all have done. Let me just ask, 3 of you have mentioned Section 1504 of the Dodd-Frank bill. To effectively implement it was mentioned. The need to implement, apparently the failure to do so, and I'm sure there's some reasons why they have not gotten around to do it, including court challenges. But if any of you would like to expand upon what you construe to be the holdup as to why that very important provision has not been implemented.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I'm happy to start answering that question. I know others on the panel can as well. The SEC actually issued rules, the final rules for Section 1504 in August of 2012. And they were very strong rules. They met the full intent of what Congress intended. Unfortunately, there was a lawsuit that was then filed by the American Petroleum Institute challenging Section 1504, and that was done in the fall. And so right now there's a court battle on that issue. And the court recently took a decision, the D.C. District Court recently took a decision that will require the SEC to go back and relook at the rules. But one of the things that I would want to really put into context with this is that as this is happening in court, the European Union recently adopted a transparency and accounting directive that is very complementary to Dodd-Frank. And so with the combination of the U.S. and the EU now requiring mandatory disclosure, that covers 70% of extractive companies globally that are going to have to be more transparent, and that includes Chinese companies, Russian companies, American companies, and European companies. So I think there's overall a rising tide of transparency. I think the court battle is hopefully a temporary one. The law remains the law of the land, and the SEC, we hope, will move forward with finalizing the rule based on in the next step of the process.
Do you have a sense when this might be concluded?
No, I do not, but I know that the SEC came out with a strong rule, and I think very strongly defended why they made provisions in the rule, and so we're hoping that they will move forward quickly with issuing a rule. I think that we're going to see the fact that Europe, Canada also wants to disclose. They've announced their commitment recently. Switzerland is thinking about it because there's all this global momentum. I think that the pressure is really on the U.S. to keep on moving forward and not backwards.
Mr. Adam.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this question. I think that the leadership the United States of America showed to the world in passing these provisions in the Dodd-Frank Reform Act is commendable. And I believe this was what influenced the European Union to recently pass a similar law. The United Kingdom and France have indicated that they want to fast-track the mainstreaming of the EU law into their national laws and to begin implementation of the law. And I'm just wondering if the EU was just taking a cue from the leadership provided by the U.S., why the U.S. will lag as far as pushing the implementation of these provisions. And so I want to encourage you, and through you, the SEC, to also fast-track the process. If they have to bring out new rules, they should do it as a matter of urgency, because African citizens, citizens of African countries cannot wait any longer while corporate corruption with the connivance of our governments are plundering the resources God has blessed us with. Thank you.
Unfortunately, our courts move so slowly. We just had, from my point of view, a setback unrelated to today's discussion. But back in the beginnings of the PEPFAR program, I wrote a provision into the bill to preclude funding to those groups that were not overtly against sex trafficking and prostitution. And a very workable way of dealing with women who are in brothels was worked out by USAID. And despite that, it took 10 years for that provision to make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. I was there during the oral arguments at the U.S. Supreme Court earlier. Unfortunately, they ruled against the provision that I offered 10 years ago to the original President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and which was a true setback, because I lead in this Congress on combating sex trafficking. And even during the oral stage, Justice Roberts asked a question, and I'm only saying this because fast tracking is something that once it gets into our courts, the chances are slim and none. Hopefully here it'll at least be slim. And that is that Justice Roberts asked a question, and again, this is unrelated, but just to give a further insight as to why your frustration, which is shared by those of us on this side of the dais as well, asked a very good question. He said if an organization was doing wonderful work on clean water in South Africa during the years of apartheid, and another group was totally against apartheid, one group, an NGO, is for it, and we made a choice to go with the group that was anti-apartheid, would that be constitutionally suspect, or could it be allowed? And the lawyer for the other side had no good answer, and yet they've ruled against our provision. So, but it took 10 years, the point that I'm trying to make. Mr. Bolden, if I could ask you with regards to meeting with the farmers who were displaced, you mentioned that they were offered a cash buyout. Did they give you any indication how poor, how inferior, how lack of adequacy that buyout had? How little of money was it?
I think if I can remember, I think it was about $10,000, which we all know isn't enough money to sustain
for a farm.
Yes, and like I said, they were living off of their land, so that obviously is not enough money to sustain them. And I mean, just from my experience, I mean, I think it's obviously it's unfair, but it's inhumane for people to be treated that way. To be literally living on top of a gold mine and have your land taken from you. And then the people that have taken your land from you comes in and makes millions, billions of dollars off of your land. So, I mean, we all know $10,000 isn't fairly enough, to be compensated for.
And it's your land, and it has the gold.
Exactly.
It has to be a double insult. Let me ask you, if I could, with regards to what are those people doing now? How displaced are they? Are they in abject poverty as a direct result of this? And did the government give any indication of trying to provide some kind of recompense to them?
Unfortunately, we didn't have a chance to speak with government officials. We talked to the local officials, and yes, they are in poverty, which is the reason why a lot of the locals are trying to take to mining to even, put a meal on their table. And like I described in my letter, I had an opportunity to go through the entire process of trying to find gold. And trust me, it's not fun. But this is what they're reduced to on a daily basis just to try to survive.
Yeah. Mr. Alicante, you mentioned in your testimony, and you list how the president's family and friends have so egregiously benefited from the wealth. The son of the president of Equatorial Guinea has allegedly used several anonymous U.S. shell companies to launder more than $100 million of corrupt funds into the United States to finance a number of luxury purchases. DOJ, we're told, is investigating that. Do you have any insight as to how well the investigations, not just on his case, but some of these other cases, are proceeding by the U.S. Department of Justice?
Thank you, Chairman, for that question. Yes, we are in touch with some of the investigators in the Department of Justice. Our sense is right now the judges in both cases, mind you, in the U.S. there are two cases, one in California, one in Washington, D.C. The judges in both cases have required the DOJ to file additional documents proving probable cause and showing a direct link to Mr. Teodoro Nguema Obiang, Teodorin. In response to your earlier question, Mr. Chairman, about the holdup on 1504 and connected to this question, I think part of what we're hoping that you would do here is help create an environment in which transparency becomes an essential part, the quintessential part of U.S. policy with countries like Equatorial Guinea. I mentioned in my remarks, alluded to the Incorporation Transparency and Law Enforcement Assistance Act, which Congresswoman Maloney will introduce. I think that the Section 1504, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and several different tools are what needs to become part of how U.S. engages with countries or governments like the ones in Senegal, Equatorial Guinea, Ghana, and others.
Okay, thank you for that. You mentioned in your testimony that the 2013 Africa Progress Report by Kofi Annan showed that Equatorial Guinea is richer than Poland, but has a child death rate nearly 20 times higher. And I know some years back the government and USAID had entered into an agreement, and some $20 million was spent on social programs. And I'm wondering if you could shed some insight onto whether or not that it failed. It didn't proceed and go forward. But whether or not, with all of that wealth, the fact that children are dying or having high morbidity rates is just appalling. Maybe you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Indeed, that is the situation, Mr. Chairman, in which there is vast amount of money coming from oil in Equatorial Guinea, and those of us from that country cannot understand why our nieces and nephews continue to suffer despite this amount of money. My sense is that the different programs that the government has claimed to have instituted have not gone anywhere. The government now has an economic plan, Horizon 2020, which is not even funded. The project that they have with USAID has not gone anywhere. So we don't know what the government is doing in terms of social development inside the country.
Let me just ask you, and others might want to say something on this as well. We haven't mentioned China, and China certainly has been ripping off Africa. I mean, that's no excuse for the foreign multinationals, including those from the United States, that take advantage and fleece governments and the people by extension. But we know China, and I remember Greg and I were actually in the DR Congo on one trip en route to Goma, and we heard story after story of roads being built in such a way to ensure that the Chinese government was able to, again, extract minerals and things that they wanted, and the cost of that was the road, and whatever they found on the right and on the left somehow went into their pocket, and it's a huge problem. We know that Africa is looking for investment, and roads and infrastructure are at the top of the list, but the Chinese come in exchange for that work. They end up in a very bad bargain, in my opinion, because we heard about a number of them in DR Congo, get these very, very precious minerals and metals at below bargain-based prices. If you wanted to speak to that. And secondly, I would like to ask if you could, Karina, you mentioned, let me find it again, that you had numbers, actual numbers for DR Congo, 1.36 billion from the underpriced sales of cobalt and copper mining between 2010 and 2012. Okay, 1.36 billion was paid. Is there any estimate as to what the real market price would have been? How far below the real cost is that? So if you could speak to the China issue, anyone who would like to, and then to that.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. On the issue of China, just a few things on that. Global Witness has definitely looked at Chinese investment in the extractive sector in China because it has grown so much. We looked, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo at a resource for infrastructure agreement there and looked into how there was nearly $24 million of a Chinese government's signature bonus payment that were not answered as far as what was regarding that payment. So what we're finding is that though China is investing in the region, China is also vulnerable to these issues of corruption and conflict. And so any kind of corruption or conflict in these resource-rich countries can adversely affect China and their investment. And so one of the things that we're looking at, for example, is to try to engage with the Chinese government to raise their awareness about transparency and how transparency can actually help in their own operations. I was actually just in Shanghai in May to basically talk with some of the policymakers in Shanghai about the work that we're doing on transparency. The other thing is that I think we're going to bring in some Chinese companies to be more transparent through implementation of the Dodd-Frank Act. You'll have big Chinese companies like Sinopec and PetroChina that will have to disclose. So we will be bringing in Chinese companies that way. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative actually does have Chinese companies already disclosing an EITI, and you have that in countries like Mongolia and Nigeria. So at least you're bringing in Chinese companies and to an extent the Chinese government in raising awareness about the importance of transparency and how that could adversely affect them. On the issue of the DRC and the selling of the secret mining assets, those assets, as I understand it, were sold at 1/16 of the value. So that was a huge, just tragically, what a loss to Congo to have their valuable mining assets sold at 1/16 of the commercial market value. So that's just an example of what happens when you have these secret mining deals. You have these deals done in secret, and you are basically allowing these companies sometimes companies who you don't even know who owns the companies enter into deals with government elites, essentially robbing the country of billions of dollars. And so that's why we're calling for transparency, not just of revenues, but transparency across the value chain. So you have transparency of bidding processes, transparency of contracts. We're hearing about how in Ghana contracts aren't made public. We're talking about transparency around who owns companies. Those are the kinds of transparency that we need that will hopefully prevent some of these really bad and harmful deals from happening. And we're hoping very much that the U.S. can help support more transparency in its foreign policy and through actively supporting the EITI and moving forward with Dodd-Frank.
Yes, Mr. Adam.
Yes, I want to touch on the China question. China's relationship with Ghana's natural resources is at 3 levels. First of all, the government of Ghana signed an agreement with the China Development Bank for a loan facility of $3 billion US, and that is the highest loan facility Ghana is ever contracted. But the difficulty with this loan is that it is collateralized against future oil revenues. And therefore, when the loans are not used efficiently to develop the country, future oil revenues and future development for that matter are compromised. But the difficulty around this loan also is that a Chinese company, China Bosal, has acquired a mining concession, what we call Awoso Mines, to exploit bauxite. And 2 projects that are to be funded from the loan contracted from China are to benefit China rather than Ghana. Because one of these projects is a railway line, which is to be constructed to the bauxite mine, which is now owned by a Chinese company to enable them exploit and transport bauxite. The second project is the expansion of the port where the bauxite will be shipped out. And both projects are funded from a loan contracted from the China Development Bank, which Ghana will have to pay with future oil revenues, and which, as I said earlier, will compromise future development. The second level of China's relationship with our natural resources has to do with small-scale mining. Our country's law does not allow foreigners to partake in small-scale mining. But the small-scale mining sector in Ghana lately has been dominated by Chinese workers. And we have recorded a series of human rights abuses, destruction of the environment, which led to the government of Ghana setting up a task force of security agencies to arrest.
What kind of human rights abuses, if you could just elaborate on that? What kind of human rights abuses?
Human rights abuses in the sense that the communities who are living near the exploitation of these resources, their water is being polluted, their farmlands are being mined, and they are not able to prevent the Chinese workers from mining on their farmlands. And in some cases when they have complained, Chinese mine workers have used weapons against them, and we have actually recorded some deaths in those areas. So this angered the government of Ghana. That led to the setting up of a task force of security agencies, and 501 Chinese workers have been arrested by the government of Ghana, most of whom have been deported. But this has also brought about a diplomatic role between the Chinese government and Ghana, for which reason requirements for visa from China has been made more stringent. Some Ghanaian traders go to China to bring in goods, and therefore, because of the difficulties Ghana has faced, as a result of which Chinese mine workers are being deported, they have made stringent the requirements for acquiring visa to Ghana. There are some discussions between the two governments, but what the indication I get is that the Chinese are able to find their way out. And this is why transparency is so important. But beyond transparency, the need to support civil society, the citizens, who will bring pressure to bear on their government, so that their government is able to contract loans that will serve the interests of the country other than the lenders. And when I say this, it's not just the Awosu mine. Ghana is compelled to sell its oil to China alone. And therefore, as part of the loan agreement, it's an off-taker agreement for oil. We cannot sell our oil to any other country of our choice, except China. And so this is how they tie your hands. Through loans like this. And if the citizenry are not given the support and the capacity to voice out their concerns, to put pressure to bear on their government to contract good loans, the country will suffer eventually.
Just one small question. How long in effect will be this requirement of selling all of the oil to China?
Yes, until we are able to repay the loan. And that is supposed to take a period of 10 to 15 years.
Wow. Okay. Anybody else yes?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would like to reiterate the points that Mr. Adams have made about the importance of civil society, because Equatorial Guinea is one of those cases in which transparency alone is not enough. Equatorial Guinea does not have an independent press. Equatorial Guinea has a Congress, a parliament that is 99% with the ruling party. Equatorial Guinea does not have an independent judiciary. Equatorial Guinea does not have a vibrant civil society. So the point that my colleague makes about supporting civil society, about building the infrastructure for good governance is critical before 1504 and other EITI and other transparency mechanisms can be fully realized in a place like Equatorial Guinea. China is not invested in the oil industry in Equatorial Guinea. China is invested in the construction industry in Equatorial Guinea. But one point I make to people in the United States is that there is a certain reputational value that comes with operating with the United States. President Obiang and his government know that. But there is a reason why President Obiang spends millions of dollars in lobbying here in Washington, D.C. They know that it's important to keep their businesses with the United States. And that, for me, is a leverage point. That, to me, is why Congress can actually help address the resource course in a place like Equatorial Guinea, despite the threat of China. Thank you.
Ms. Bass.
Well, I have to tell you that some of the testimony today is a little discouraging, I guess, especially from a country like Ghana, which I want to ask you some questions about. But, I just refuse to view this as Africa's curse. Because to me, if you say that, then it almost, you're almost saying that there's nothing that can be done about it. Any other time, we would look at the unbelievable natural resources as a blessing. And I think that it's important to have that frame of mind, because policy can change. These situations can change. So anyway, that's my little editorial statement. But did you want to say something?
Congresswoman Bass, certainly resources in Equatorial Guinea, the oil itself, the gas itself, we consider those a blessing. Our problem again is the governance.
Right.
The lack of an accountable government, the lack of a transparent, we have one of the most closed societies in Equatorial Guinea, and that is what turns oil itself into a curse.
Sure.
So I agree with you.
Absolutely. And, one issue I want to take up in general with all the panelists, because, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., I want to know about U.S. corporate involvement and U.S. practices. And then you do make some mentions, especially in your recommendations. You said a few minutes ago, I think, that education, working with the Chinese, and I guess I'm curious as to why you think that educating the Chinese about transparency, I think they would know. Right? Why? Go ahead.
Well, we're actually, for Global Witness, we do investigations into what governments are doing and companies are doing as far as how they the trade in natural resources. And so we're not just educating the Chinese government, we're actually doing investigations, basically looking at Chinese investment in Africa and how that affects Africa. That's why we did look at the resource for infrastructure deals that China did, for example, in the Congo, and we found a lot of problems with that, with the deal that the Chinese did. They've been
receptive to the investigations?
Well, we're kind of having a dialogue with them, but it's not necessarily, translating into any huge policy change yet. I think what we are also advocating, though, is for regulations, and that's why Dodd-Frank is so effective, because it will bring in Chinese companies. Any Chinese company registered with the SEC will have no choice but to comply with Dodd-Frank. The same with the EITI. Any Chinese company operating in a country that is part of EITI, that Chinese company will have to participate in EITI. It will have to disclose information. So at Global Witness, we're approaching a lot of different tools. We're doing investigations to expose the problems, whether it's the Chinese companies or Chinese government. We're doing policy measures that will bring in the Chinese, and we're also doing dialogue with the Chinese government, like we do with all governments and with companies.
Thank you.
As far as company involvement, I think that's a very crucial question, and I think. And I also want to respond to your question or your comment about how, this isn't all. We have to look at these resources as a blessing. And I think one of the things that I wanted to get across in the testimony was that there are some good things going on. We're kind of, there's a lot of momentum on transparency, and we're beginning to see through the EITI and through other mechanisms where citizens are starting to use this data and go to governments and say, wait a minute, what's going on with our resources? And for example, with EITI, if you talk about Nigeria and even Liberia, because of EITI, they're actually looking at what are the companies saying they pay to the government, what is the government saying that they're receiving, and they're finding missing money. For example, in Nigeria, they found about $800 million that was going missing, and they were able to rectify that through the EITI. And we're
found
seeing
the money and people were arrested, or what?
I'm sorry?
They found, you said $800 million.
In that case, it was sometimes it was an issue of collection, not even keeping track of what companies should be paying. So it's even things like that, basic things like that, where you can find some problems in the system. And then we're seeing that civil society groups are starting to engage with governments. For example, in Tanzania, I know that there was civil society groups and a parliamentary review that found problems with the collection of taxes and royalties, and through those efforts, they found loopholes, and they've done a law, or they've done some efforts to close the loophole. So I think that we're seeing, as more of this data comes out, we're seeing citizens using that. Parliaments use that as well. So I think that there's some reason to be optimistic in that we've got this data coming out. I think what's really important is that the transparency tide needs to move forward, and we cannot just focus on revenues, but we need to focus across the value chain. We need to look at allocation of licenses, contracts, making that all public. The United States government has such an important role to play, and we would like to see the U.S. government make natural resource requirements, transparency requirements, an integral part of its assistance. So to say to resource countries, we'll give you aid, but we would like to see some progress on transparency. As far as companies, it's very important for companies to be more transparent about their operations. And we're seeing some companies do that. For example, Newmont, a huge mining company that operates in Africa, they actually realized...
That's a U.S. company?
Yes, a U.S. company,
where?
Sorry, yeah. Sorry?
Where? From where?
I think it's based in Colorado. I think I'm right, yes. So they realized in the 1990s, for example, I think it was one country was Indonesia. They were realizing that they were paying their taxes to the government, and they realized that communities they didn't know how much Newmont Mining was paying to the government. And so there was a lot of concern. And so Newmont thought, well, maybe we need to publish the taxes, et cetera, that we're paying to the government. Otherwise, this helps to build trust with the communities. Otherwise, if we don't publish that information, then communities, rightfully so, are going to be like, wait a minute, these are our resources. where is the money going when you're here in our communities? Where is the money going? So that's why Newmont Mining is now publishing the payments that it's making. I think another really important aspect of this, though, is not just on the transparency of whether it's the contracts or the revenues, but also on the human rights side of things. What are the impacts on mining, for example, in mining to communities? And I know that Oxfam, is working a lot on free, prior, informed consent. So that's really having meaningful dialogue with communities and giving them the opportunity to be able to decide, whether they want extraction and how it should be done. So I think that that's another thing. But it's a positive movement. Some mining companies are starting to embrace that principle. So I think we're seeing some positive movement by some companies. I think other companies, like the oil companies, the big, oil companies, Shell, BP, Exxon, Chevron are kind of putting their heads in the sand, and they're not wanting to be transparent, at least not with Dodd-Frank, but they are actually already signed up to transparency to an extent because they support the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. So there's kind of a disconnect with their position. But I think that the tide globally is for transparency, and all these companies are going to have to be transparent under Dodd-Frank and through EITI.
Mr. Adam, you thank you. You had mentioned when you were talking about Ghana, and you described Ghana positively in the sense that, there are movements toward transparency and things are getting better. But one of the things you pointed out that I wanted to ask you if you would talk a little bit more about was it sounded like a capacity issue as opposed to a political will issue. And I think you talked about Ghana was unable to implement accountability measures, and wanted to know if you could speak a little more about that. What's holding it back? Is there a way the U.S. can be supported?
First of all, let me say two things about U.S. corporate involvement in Ghana. We have three companies, Newmont, Anadarko, and Cosmos. But I want to talk about Cosmos in particular. Cosmos' involvement in Ghana has been positive and negative somehow.
What does Cosmos do?
Cosmos Energy is an oil company from Texas area. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
So the first issue is Cosmos once spilled toxic mud in Ghana's waters. Our law provides for polluter pay principle, that the polluter will have to be responsible for the pollution. But our government didn't have the capacity to establish the extent of pollution. And so that led to difficulties between Cosmos and the government of Ghana. Even though Cosmos eventually paid about $15 million US as compensation, it exposed the weaknesses of our country as far as environmental management is concerned. But the other side, which I think is positive, is that our government used to argue against contract disclosure on the excuse that it would compromise commercially sensitive information. And that will put the government in the light of violating contracts. But because Cosmos had to list on one of the U.S. stock exchanges as a requirement, they had to disclose their contracts. And so we went back to our government and said, the reason for which you were holding the contract is no longer valid, because Cosmos, by listing on the U.S. stock exchange, has disclosed the contract. And that then compelled our government to disclose the contract and 6 other contracts. And this is what I think is very positive. The fact that
because they were listed on the stock exchange?
New York Stock Exchange.
That, could you explain that again?
Yes.
They listed the contract, and then Ghana was able to expose what was in the contract?
Yes, they listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and that required them to disclose all information relating to their operation, including the petroleum contracts. So our government didn't have the moral justification for holding the contracts confidential any longer. And this, I think, was very positive. The fact that Cosmos listed on the New York Stock Exchange, that compelled our government eventually to disclose the contract and 6 other contracts, which we think is very positive. But coming to your question, the issue in Ghana is both a political will, but also a capacity issue. We are relatively doing better within our region in terms of capacity. and therefore our governance structures are seen to be working, even though there are challenges, including budgetary challenges, sometimes political interference. I think that our democracy is quite strong, and the citizenry is also quite awake. Civil society is very active. Apart from that, our citizens are much strong when it comes to voicing out their concerns, and our governments have been open as far as providing the space for dialogue with citizens. So these are some of the measures that have pushed Ghana forward in terms of how we manage our resources and the governance around our resources. But as I said, there are risks involved, and some of the risks are associated with the fact that we haven't developed some of our petroleum-related legislation to the level that will support openness. So far, we do not have provision on open and competitive bidding process for oil concession in our law, because the industry is also new in Ghana. Yeah. We are into 2 years of production. We also do not have mandatory disclosure. The disclosures we have had so far were at the discretion of the minister. And so if you have a different minister who has a different policy, it means that contracts will not be disclosed any longer. And the issue we are worried about is the budget that the new institutions we are establishing to protect the integrity of our oil resources are not given. The Petroleum Commission is the regulator. It's supposed to be an independent regulator. The Public Interest and Accountability Committee is supposed to conduct independent assessment of how the oil revenues are used, but they are not given resources to work. And that is problematic. If you're creating institutions by law and you are not providing resources for them to execute their mandate, then you better did not, if you hadn't built those institutions, the better for you. And that is the risk that we are going into. Compared to Nigeria, where the vested interest is so entrenched, and where the elite class has already been built, we are yet to see the building of such an elite class because the industry is still new. But if it has happened in Nigeria, it could happen in Ghana. The potential for oil to also weaken our institutions is also high. And so we want to support citizenry, the civil society, so that they are empowered beyond where we are to hold our governments and other companies operating in Ghana accountable.
The U.S. supporting civil society is clear. Are there ways that you think the U.S. could be supportive in terms of building the accountability structure?
Yes, the U.S. can support in many ways. First of all, providing technical support to the institutions in Ghana working in the natural resources sector. For instance, our revenue authorities need capacity to be able to conduct petroleum auditing.
Do we do that? We need to do it, or we need to do more of it?
At the moment, no.
What did you say?
No.
We don't do that?
Yes. You have to do that. You have to support us. Yeah.
Whether or not they can do that. Did anyone else want to comment about the general questions?
Definitely, to the question of U.S. oil companies' involvement in Equatorial Guinea, as I mentioned during my remarks, the major companies are American companies. American companies arrived to Equatorial Guinea at a time where there was no law, there was no legal regime regulating the activities of oil companies or anything that was going to affect the industry as a whole. They had an opportunity to help set a place, the environment for fair play that Mr. Baldwin referred to. That did not happen. And right now what we are seeing is that many of these companies are the ones that are siding with the American Petroleum Institute to ensure that 1504 does not become the law of the land, sending a clear message that they prefer to operate in that type of secret environment. In a situation like Equatorial Guinea, I think critically one thing that's missing is political will from the government, and which is why I think, as Mr. Adams talked about, support for civil society, support to create independent institutions that can hold governments accountable, support to create a free press is critical for countries, resource-rich countries in Africa, in order to help reverse the resource course.
So what kind of support do we provide for civil society in Equatorial Guinea? Do you know?
Right now, very minimal. It's partly because of the challenges of the government that we're dealing with.
Right. I mean, to me, and it's interesting, the chair spoke that earlier today we acknowledged President Mandela's 95th birthday, and a lot of the presentations talked about the history of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States. And, it's one thing for us to talk about how people in other countries should hold their governments accountable, but I think if we have U.S. businesses behaving in this way, then we need to look at their level of accountability. And there's a long history here in our country of holding our businesses accountable, and I think it's important that we look at what's happening in Equatorial Guinea and look at ways that we might be able to be supportive. Dodd-Frank is great, but there's other things, as well.
Indeed. I mean, I think I can point to, at the very least, two critical things that the U.S. can do. Certainly, ensuring that governments or people in government in Equatorial Guinea do not travel to the United States, I think is critical.
Don't travel to the United States, what?
Denying visas to members of the EG government, of the Equatorial Guinean government, whether it's through Proclamation 7750 or whether it's by finding a way to expand the Magnitsky Act, which I referred to. I think that is critical. But besides that, I mean, I think definitely supporting with funding organizations based in the country, I think is critical. My understanding is that the U.S. State Department has a number of programs, whether it's cultural visitation, cultural ambassadorships, and different programs. They allow for members of civil society in places like Equatorial Guinea, where the government makes it impossible for civil society to operate, to come to other countries or go to other countries in Africa and network with people working on some of these critical issues. So there are a number of ways which I've brought to the attention of people in the African Bureau and DRL, Department of Labor, Human Rights and Democracy, which we're hoping to begin to find ways to support civil society on the ground. So.
Botswana is often held up as a country that has been a great steward of their natural resources, in particular the diamonds. And I don't know if anybody on the panel is prepared to comment about that, but I did want to kind of shift to ask what do you as members of the panel think are good examples on the continent where people have been good stewards? Mr. Adam?
Yeah. I think that Botswana is a good example indeed, but this is as a result of two factors. One, because of the provisions in their law that promotes transparency, and secondly, because of their investment policy. They are able to invest the revenues that are coming from their natural resources in areas that promote the highest return. Education is one of the priorities in Botswana. And so through education, you are building even a more critical citizenry that will continue to demand accountability of you, and that compels you to be more transparent and more accountable. That has been the secret behind Botswana. And Ghana, as I said earlier, is following this path by making laws that promote transparency and accountability. But the difficulty in Ghana is whether we are able to implement some of the regulations and the rules that we are developing.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Ms.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with the example of Botswana, though I think that there could still be stronger transparency measures. Just one thing on the issue of holding companies to account. I think that is a really important issue, and I just wanted to follow up on that. Because I know for Global Witness, we do a lot of work, as I mentioned before, looking at companies that could be complicit in corruption. And in the United States, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is very, very, very much an important law for holding companies to account for bribery. And that's one of the things that we're looking for as far as the U.S. Government really being proactive as far as investigating some of these major corruption cases. Some of the ones that I've outlined today, actually, the one in Guinea, which I understand the U.S. government is investigating. There's a case in Nigeria as well about Shell giving payments to the Nigerian government that then went to a company called Malibu Oil and Gas. that we've found out was controlled by the Abacha-era minister, Dana Tete. And so there are some real corruption concerns related to that case. It's a very active case or a controversial issue in Nigeria, and that's an example of where we think the U.S. should be investigating more and looking for issues of corruption. I think Tutu Alicante had mentioned the case of rigged. I forgot the bank's name now. It's not been around for a while. It used to be a mainstream, a big institution in D.C. But for Riggs Bank, and how that was followed up on, there wasn't really a full FCPA investigation, although Riggs Bank did go down related to some issues around that. But I just think that the FCPA, it's encouraging that the administration has been prosecuting a lot of companies where it's merited, but we do think that there could be more done, especially in these extractive cases where you have just huge amounts of money that are involved and potentially serious corruption issues. So I think that's a very important way to hold companies to account. And I just wanted to follow up on that, on your point.
Anybody want to comment on the role of the African Union? I mean, I can imagine what its potential is, but what about what it's doing now?
Yes, the African Union is concerned about how natural resources have been managed so far, and they now see natural resources as one of the important growth pillars that could transform African economies. And so they have developed and published what we call the African Mining Vision, which defines the framework for exploiting Africa's natural resources. And the vision has very strong transparency components, but also very strong investment policies on how revenues from natural resources can be invested to support the growth of Africa's economies. The African Mining Vision has been endorsed by African heads of states. But it's as an institution, we all recognize the weaknesses of that institution and whether they can be able to push the mining vision, as excellent as it is, into the laws of member countries is another issue. Fact is that some countries in Africa are doing well in governance, others are not. And the African Union doesn't have that leverage, to be able to carry everybody along. And this is why in my testimony, I was also calling for the strengthening of the regional level initiative, the African Union, the ECOWAS, so that they are able to justify why their member states must adopt good practices and good governance practices in the management of their natural resources.
Mr. Adams have addressed the points that I was going to raise. I think to say that the African Union faces challenges, is really to stating the obvious. The fact that President Obiang was the chair of the African Union a couple of years ago sends a clear message of what one should expect of the African Union. Nevertheless, the fact that the U.S. has an ambassador and has a presence within the African Union, to me, represent yet another opportunity where members of this Congress can actually push the African Union to do certain things, to stand by the principles of transparency, by the principles of democracy and human rights.
Mr. Marino.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I'm, like my colleagues, I'm very concerned about and I'll use the term loosely, investments being made in Africa and around the various countries within Africa, particularly by China, who plans to spend over $23 billion in 4 countries to build oil refineries. Iran, at least 6 countries, they're talking about building oil refineries, and Egypt as well. And it's disconcerting given the fact that we're talking about China, a communist country, Iran, a radical dictatorship, is having such a footprint on the continent of Africa. And I think there has to be some answers, and this has to be done globally, I think, by the free market and banking industry is saying, what is happening with this money? I've been to Ghana. I've been to Liberia. I know Ghana is is in a little better shape than Liberia, but we're talking about billions and billions of dollars in investments by these countries, communist countries and terrorist-backed countries. And still the United States is still pumping about $5 to $6 billion a year into countries around Africa for humanitarian purposes. And I guess I'm making a statement more so than asking a question as to what are the terms of these loans. I understand, do I pronounce it right? The billionaire, first billionaire on the continent, Dangote, worth $20 billion now, just accumulated about $12 billion over the last couple of years, securing a $4.5 billion loan from overseas banks to build an oil refinery. Now, I hope that's a good thing for the continent and the countries because of jobs and money coming into there. But we need to keep a close watch on what's taking place there, given the fact that we are dumping almost $6 billion a year in for humanitarian needs. If anyone want to respond to my thoughts on this, I'd be glad to hear it. Please.
Thank you, Representative Marino. We completely agree with you on the point of the fact that the United States is giving aid to these countries. And we're not opposed to the aid, but I think one of the questions that's concerning is that if you are giving aid to a country that's rich in natural resources, but those resources and the revenues are being squandered, then you're subsidizing corruption, essentially. And so, I think that's why we are very, very much focused on, one, the issue of transparency around deals, the terms of the deals, who's benefiting from the deals. Because at least if you bring that out into the open, that's a very powerful way of deterring corruption and giving citizens, parliaments, and others the ability to challenge that or to say what is going on here. And so that's transparency, all across the value chain. That's transparency when you are having biddings for these rights. Oftentimes the bids are secretive. There's not transparency around the bidding processes, and that just fuels corruption and allows the kind of deals that you're potentially talking about. So I think that's one really important thing that we can do to try and stop those kind of harmful deals from happening. The other thing is as far as U.S. assistance to resource-rich countries, I think that we do need to look at the assistance that we're giving and whether we want to tie certain conditions or requirements. If we are giving assistance to a resource-rich country where there's a lot of corruption and mismanagement, do we want to have some benchmarks for that country to have to meet, requiring greater transparency, that kind of thing?
There, because as a prosecutor for 18 years, now I'm not accusing anyone of corruption at this point because I don't have facts indicating that. I can make a supposition of some type, but I've always followed the money, whether that's in organized crime or drug dealing or selling arms illegally to countries that we shouldn't, that individuals shouldn't. But I'm concerned because being on foreign affairs and on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I see a great deal that's taking place that just the United States cannot have an impact on. This is an international crisis, I think. And I've studied for the longest time China and the Soviet Union. And we used to think at one time, foolishly, that China wanted to take the world over militarily. Well, they don't have to do that anymore. They can do it financially and economically. China's investments around the world are staggering. Who's investing in Afghanistan, other than the U.S. being there and some allies? China is dumping tons of money into Afghanistan, not for tomorrow, not for next year, but 5 or 10 years from now, because China knows the natural resources that are valuable natural resources that only Afghanistan has. And China's going to get its arms around that. I think it's doing the same thing in Africa. And there's a parallel here that is, I think, a paradox, because at this point I've seen how poor and what the conditions are. Liberia is, for example, has one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world. But when a country comes in and starts dumping money and eventually figures, well, we'll build a hospital here, we'll build a school there, I do not blame the people of those countries wanting that, but there's an ulterior motive, and internationally this is going to have to be handled. Internationally, the United Nations should be looking into these matters as well, but we know we're not going to get very much service from the United Nations in situations like this. So I'm in a quandary here. I mean, we could simply say it would be foolish for us to say the U.S. is going to stop all aid to countries on the continent of Africa, the humanitarian aid. I don't know if if China or if Iran or Egypt would step in and continue humanitarian aid with their resources. I kind of guess that may not happen. So simply just pulling money out and stopping aid is not the answer. And the United States is going to need input from other democratic countries as well on how it's none of our business to a certain extent on what is being done with the funds and the profits. But I think from a humanitarian standpoint, someone has to show the rest of the world what is happening with these profits and who is walking away with it. With that said, I have no questions. If any of the other gentlemen would like to comment on my statement, please.
I'll start. Mr. Chairman, one of the factors that increase China's entry into resource-rich countries is because for those resource-rich countries, they have come to realize that increased resource wealth increases their leverage, increases their strength, they become more credit-worthy, and therefore they can go and pledge their oil or minerals for loans from China, as opposed to the international development financial organizations like the World Bank, the IMF, and some other private banks, but through the Equator Principles, who will demand certain governance requirements as a condition for granting them the loan. This, I believe, is what has pushed some of them to go into China. And so if the U.S. will withdraw their support on humanitarian grounds, citizens are going to suffer for the mistakes of their governments. And I think that one of the ways to go about it is to support increased democratization in these countries. When citizens are given greater democracy and greater participation, when reforms about governance are pursued in those countries, citizens can hold their governments to account and then influence who their governments go into a relationship or a contract with.
I understand what you're saying there, but we certainly don't want a situation, we don't want to continue drawn-out civil war like we've seen in Liberia. We certainly don't want any civil war, but once again, I'm perplexed on the way we go about this unless democratic countries around the world coalesce and come up with some type of plan to address these issues and to call countries like China and Iran out on what they are doing and let the rest of the world know, are these legitimate transactions, what is happening with the funds that are being generated there. Please, go ahead.
Can I just respond? And I agree wholeheartedly with what Mr. Adams said, and I think for humanitarian aid, that's very crucial to Africa. But one thing on where this money goes, I think another effective policy tool is really combating the illicit flows that are going out of Africa. And you had mentioned your background, and I think that that's a very interesting tool for the United States to use, is that you have all of this corrupt money that's exiting Africa and going out into the U.S. financial system. In fact, there's estimates from the Global Financial Integrity that you have $1.4 trillion in illicit financial flows going out of Africa. And what we're finding through our investigations and what we've heard about Equatorial Guinea and other places is when you have these corrupt deals, then these government elites basically take the money and siphon it off and put it offshore in the United States and other places. So I think in answer to your question, one really important policy tool is for the United States to do everything it can to prevent corrupt and illicit money from entering into the U.S. And there are several ways we can do it. One is that through our anti-money laundering laws, we can enforce those much more effectively. Another thing we can do is require transparency around who ultimately owns companies here in the United States, because I think corrupt money can come into the United States and other places through anonymous shell companies. So those kinds of reforms could really make a difference and address one of the issues you're talking about, which is where does all this money go? If we make it difficult for it to go to the United States, then maybe it has more of a chance of actually staying in Africa and contributing to development there.
I agree with you to a certain extent, but don't forget, when we look at trade, just simply trade from here in the United States around the world, 95% of our trade, the people who are going to buy our products live outside the United States. So it's going to be difficult for the United States, which we should be following the money in the United States to see if it's laundered, but that's not going to solve the problem. They're just going to go to another country. They're going to make investments back in China. Who knows what's going to happen in Iran? They're financially in a bad position now, but I just don't think the United States is going to have that much of an impact on following money that's invested from these types of countries here in the United States. So with that, I yield back the time that I do not have left.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moreno. You know, this committee is blessed with very effective and very credentialed members. It is worth noting that when it comes to prosecutions, we do have a former U.S. attorney in Mr. Moreno, and he has been a very effective member of this committee, and I'm grateful for his leadership. I do have just a few final questions before we conclude. Mr. Bolden, you mentioned in your testimony the need for a regional mining code, and I wonder if you might want to expand upon that a bit, or anyone else on this distinguished panel, which would apply to 15 countries in the region. It is, suggested that it would be a value added. It would give a much more useful tool to this whole effort to promote transparency and accountability. If you would like to expand upon that, or any of the other members of the panel.
Yes, I think just adopting the regional mining code not only promotes transparency, but it also puts everybody on a level playing field. As for me, Mr. Moreno said, that we're dumping, foreign aid into these countries, and is not our business. But to be honest with you, if we're dumping that kind of money into a country, I think it is our business to make everybody accountable on the money that's being spent in those countries. I think the U.S. does a great job outside of this country as far as helping others, but I also think that we have to spend responsibly as well, in other countries, and make other countries accountable for the money that we're dumping into their countries.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Adam?
Mr. Chairman, one of the important safeguards in the African, the ECOWAS Mining Directive is the protection of communities affected by the exploitation of these resources. When the companies and government want to exploit the resource, they do not seek the consent of the communities. There are some countries like Ghana that have laws which empower the government to compulsorily acquire the land and farmlands belonging to the people. What they do is to pay compensation, which in most cases is very low because they are determined by government agencies as opposed to market rates. And so communities are disadvantaged. They are paid one-off compensation, but they will have to suffer for the rest of their lives. And therefore, the ECOWAS Mining Directive seeks to protect the rights of communities by requiring government and companies to seek their consent before even a development of a field or a mine area is done. And this, I think, communities are looking up to the implementation of the directive. What some countries have done is just to gazette the directive, but they do not mainstream it into their laws. And when you gazette a directive, that doesn't necessarily make it a law, even though the original intention of the drafters of that mining code is for West African countries to mainstream the directive into their laws. They don't do that. And so if they are supported to enforce these directives and ensuring that the member states appreciate the value of the code, I think that communities will be protected, and therefore human rights abuses will be limited, and communities eventually will also benefit. And this brings to mind the issue of project-by-project reporting, because these communities are suffering, and yet they don't even know how much revenues the state is collecting in respect of the exploitation of their area. And so when we have project-by-project reporting, that will further empower communities to demand of their government how much they are receiving from projects in their areas, and also to constitute the basis for demanding what is due them as far as promoting their own circumstances is concerned.
Ms. Gillian, you made a statement. Your second recommendation was to make the transparent and responsible management of natural resources an integral part of U.S. foreign policy objectives, and then you give very specific examples on page 12 of your testimony. My question is the Obama administration doing that right now in July, or is this a hope that you have that they will do it? And has any other previous administrations been responsive in that regard?
We have in the past, we have very much focused on looking at the U.S. Aid to resource-rich countries, more focused on, for example, the World Bank and how the World Bank is actually looking at natural resource governance and lending to resource-rich countries. But in relation to some of the U.S. assistance, right now I don't believe that they are doing that. In particular, I'd like to point out some of the programs that the U.S. has. For example, the U.S. Energy Governance and Capacity Initiative, which is an initiative led by the State Department that's focusing on helping increase capacity of governments, particularly emerging countries with emerging oil, gas sectors. And, these kind of initiatives are very important, to help promote governance in the sectors in Africa and elsewhere. But we would like to see more of this type of assistance be explicitly linked to transparency commitments and progress made in achieving them. If the U.S. is going to be providing assistance, then I think that assistance will be more effective if there are benchmarks for a country to demonstrate that it's making progress. So I think we'd like to see more efforts by that. I think the U.S. can also exert its influence through the World Bank, through the IMF, to try and make sure that those institutions are looking at natural resource governance and trying to integrate those in its lending programs in resource-rich countries. Interestingly enough, the IMF, has done that, for example, in the Congo, where they did withhold part of a loan because of concerns around corruption in the sector, in the extractive sector in DRC. So there are examples of where that has been done, but we generally would like to see it done in a more consistent manner.
Finally, and then if you have any closing statements you'd like to make. As we all know, Section 1502 mandates that the SEC issue regulations requiring publicly traded companies to disclose the origins of listed conflict materials, and 1504 requires resource extraction issuers to disclose payments made to foreign governments. Now, the SEC obviously promulgated regulations. They are enjoined in court. We don't have any idea, at least I don't, perhaps you do, as to when that court case may be ultimately resolved one way or the other. In your view, any of you, was Dodd-Frank drafted properly? If it falls, do we have a fallback that you would recommend it's not too soon to be thinking, the idea is transparency and accountability. What do we do if the court were to find this to be unconstitutional? Part of the lawsuit that has been brought by the National Association of Manufacturers, they point out that the SEC requirements are extremely burdensome when it comes to tracing minerals back to the smelter or refinery. It seems to me, we've got to be realists about, the perfect sometimes is the enemy of the good. Is there a way of making sure that we know where these materials are coming from, these minerals, that could gain constitutional muster?
As far as your first question about was Section 1502 and 1504 done properly, I think that there were many years of deliberations in Congress where the issues of extractive industry transparency and conflict minerals have come up, both in hearings, both on the House and the Senate side. I know that for Global Witness we've worked on this issue since the late 1990s, and I've certainly been in Washington since 2004 working with members of Congress in both the House and the Senate on both of these issues, on conflict minerals, on extractive industry transparency. So there were hearings done on both issues. There was legislation introduced. It was bipartisan in particularly Senator Lugar and Senator Brownback, along with Senator Cardin, and Senator Feingold, actually, who's no longer there, along with Lugar. But anyway, they were some of the champions of these pieces of legislation in the Senate side. And so it was a bipartisan effort. There was a lot of deliberation. There was legislation out there before that was then put into Dodd-Frank. So we do believe that there was a lot of careful thought given to this. And we're seeing it really reinforced now with all of the other countries like the European Union that basically has adopted a similar provision. And we saw the Africa Progress Panel report that just came out this spring that pretty much embraced the whole idea of mandatory reporting that's in Dodd-Frank. As far as what is our backup, just on the Section 1502 case, that there's been no decision on that. The oral arguments were heard about couple weeks ago, but there's no decision on that, so we don't know where that is. But I think the reality for Section 1504 is that the rest of the world is moving towards transparency. So Europe has adopted it, as I said. Canada has announced they're adopting it. I think other countries are going to be moving forward as well. The G8 just made a commitment to doing it as well. So I think that it really is, it's here. And I think that we're hopeful that the SEC will be able to move forward with finalizing the rules and having implementation as soon as possible. We certainly believe that the SEC did the rule and did it in a way that was consistent with the congressional intent in the statute. Just on Section 1504, 1502, sorry, all these numbers, but on the conflict minerals provision, there has been a lot of progress since that provision came into effect. We have never seen so much attention focused on the Congo and trying to stop conflict minerals. Since Dodd-Frank, we have seen so much action from companies, from the Congolese government, from other actors in the Congo. For example, the DRC government now has a law requiring all companies in the trading in the mining sector to carry out due diligence to avoid sourcing conflict minerals. That's the biggest that we've seen. That's a huge development, and before Dodd-Frank, we really didn't see much meaningful progress by the Congolese government. So I think that that's huge. Another thing that's very important is that all of the private sector is really galvanized and working to comply. Now, obviously, there are challenges with knowing your supply chain, but we've got major companies like AMD, HP, GE that are actively involved in developing these joint industry initiatives that are now going on to be able to trace supply chains. So I think it's very, very positive what's going on the ground. We certainly work with, for example, the Conference of Catholic Bishops in the Congo who has testified here in Congress, and they continue to believe that Dodd-Frank is incredibly important to break the links between minerals and conflict. It will enable people in the Congo, because of the conflict in the mining areas, lots of people have not been able to pursue other livelihoods, like agriculture, for example. And so the Catholic bishops believe there that if you have Dodd-Frank, if you kind of break this link between minerals and conflict, you'll be able to have people going back into other livelihoods, because the mining sector is not particularly a great livelihood for people. It's slave-like conditions. It's very, very horrible working conditions. So I think we're in that transitional period where we're moving forward with the implementation, but we have seen demilitarization of mining areas. We've seen a lot of progress, a lot of important impacts. So I would just want to, make that clear that that's what we're finding, and we're very much hoping that the U.S. will move forward. And Europe also is now considering a similar type of provision, so that's encouraging too.
Would anyone else like to make a final comment before we conclude?
Sure. Not much to add to what Corina has said about Dodd-Frank 1504. Only to say that, as I mentioned earlier, reiterate the importance of creating a whole environment in which transparency is valued and is protected in the United States, which in my mind means also ensuring that anti-money laundering laws are taken seriously, ensuring that incorporation transparency to avoid illicit money coming into the United States through shell companies is taken seriously, ensuring that the EITI, for instance, Equatorial Guinea is in the process of reapplying, so ensuring that Equatorial Guinea is only considered after certain key benchmarks have met in the country, and also balancing all this effort in transparency with efforts to promote human rights, to promote good governance in these resource-rich countries. And again, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity to speak on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Alicante.
Yeah.
Yes,
Mr. Chairman, I also want to thank you very much and to reiterate that Ghana has shown the way, the willingness to govern the management of its resources transparently and also to invest the revenues from oil and other minerals efficiently. But Ghana still needs support in terms of institutional building. There are other countries that are emerging, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea. If Ghana is successful, I believe that it will have a spillover effect on these countries so that we can enhance improved governance of natural resources in the area. Finally, some of the contracts which we describe as bad deals are producing oil, which is consumed by many important countries, including the U.S. I understand the U.S., all the oil you consume, about 12% of that is from some African or West African countries. And if some of the oil you consume are coming from badly negotiated contracts that are tainted with corruption, I think that the U.S. will be promoting corruption if you continue to consume that oil. And therefore, as part of your bilateral relationship with countries where you're getting your oil from, you will play a very important role if you help them to improve on the governance around the contracts so that you will be consuming clean oil and then will be setting an example why other countries around the world should consume clean oil as well. I want to thank you once again for the opportunity.
Yes.
I would just like to say thank you on behalf of myself and Oxfam for lending your ear, for allowing us to make our voice heard today. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton. Thank you.
Sorry, I'd forgotten. I really wanted to also thank you, Chairman Smith, and thank you for your longstanding leadership on this issue, on transparency of extractive industries. I know that you and your staff have really been committed to this issue, and I think that that's very important. So I want to thank you for all your leadership, and we look forward to working with you more on these issues.
I want to thank each and every one of you. You have provided extraordinary insight and recommendations that are very, very specific. This is an activist subcommittee, so I can assure you we will follow up with what you have conveyed today, as well as previously. But I think today now, we are at a turning point in many ways on this whole issue. Good has been accomplished. As you said, the Europeans are now taking up this cause very robustly. And I especially, Anquan, want to thank you because the meeting we had just a few weeks ago, we were going to do this at some point, but you just brought it all to a head and said, let's go ahead and bring this information forward to hold all of us accountable. And that includes the executive branch as well as the legislative branch. We don't have much influence on the judicial branch, but let's hope they get their act together and rule soon and hopefully favorably. So thank you again for your leadership, and I'm sure the people back in Senegal had to be much pleased by your keeping your promise to keep their interests ever in front of the minds of Americans. Thank you all, and the hearing is adjourned.